Okay, let's remember the timeline of this whole case. Hay disappeared on January 13th, 1999. Her body was found a few weeks later on February 9th. Jay's first official interview happened on February 27th. He allegedly led the police to Hay's car in the early morning hours of the 28th, and Adnan was arrested a couple of hours later. Now, remember that the general story about how the police got to Adnan is that there was an anonymous call 3 days after Hay's body was found telling the police to look at the ex-boyfriend. They looked at his phone records. That led them to Jay. That led them to Jen. That led them to Jay. And then Jay handed them Adnan on a platter. But what if they were focused on Adnan way before that phone call? What if they were talking to witnesses and doing their investigation in a way that supported a case against their suspect, but allowed them to look the other way when things didn't support that case? The first witness the police spoke to after the discovery of Hay's body was Mr. A. The report says that on February 11th, he walked into the Woodlawn station house and stated that he had observed a black male driving a light-colored automobile, behaving in a suspicious manner while in Lincoln Park near some concrete roadblocks. He described a location about a mile away from where the body was discovered, and he said that he had heard of the recovery of the body on the TV news, and he wanted to help. Then the report says, "Your investigators believe that this observance is not connected to the murder of Hay Lee." As a side note, guess when this report was dated? Yep, February 14th. Okay, but the big question here is why they would decide that there was no connection. He mentioned a light-colored automobile, and Hay's car was light-colored. He described a place that was a very isolated spot, and it is kind of, in a way, a really ideal place to dump a body. And the one thing they don't mention in the report is the date on which Mr. A saw this event. If he had seen it in the last few days, like right before February 11th, then no big deal. It's logical to conclude this is not relevant to the case. But if he saw that on January 13th, then that's extremely relevant, but that's not in the report. There's also no explanation of what it means when he saw the guy behaving in a suspicious manner. What does that mean? What does that look like? More information on what this dude was doing would actually really be helpful, but that's not in the report. So the fact that they don't bother investigating this report any further leads Rabia and Susan to conclude that the police already had their eye on someone else by this point, and that's Adnan. Now, coincidentally, just before the official interview Mr. A had with the Baltimore City Police, the Baltimore County police officers were printing out Adnan's car records based on his license plate. That info included his car type, color, make, and model. So it's possible that they were looking up Adnan's car to see if it matched Mr. A's initial report. Of course, we know that the police were already pulling up information on Adnan on February 3rd, so this isn't even the first time they're looking him up. The problem with this is that it seems like it caused the police to act with blinders on. Hay's body was found on the 9th, and they didn't talk to any of her friends until March 1st. The only person they interview between these two dates is the athletic director at Woodlawn to question whether Hay filmed her segment on January 13th. Of course, we know from earlier episodes that it seems like he's wrong about that filming date. Also, a listener of the podcast actually wrote in with more information showing that the athletic director is truly probably mistaken about exactly what kind of interview Hay was doing and when. So inexplicably, the police wait all the way until March 1st, at which point they interview Hay's friend Krista. They go to her because she's one of the people called from Adnan's phone January 13th. They spend their time grilling her about a 2-second phone call that happened at 5:38, asking what they talked about. It was 2 seconds. They obviously talked about nothing because it wasn't a real phone call. But we can tell that they were not focused on where Hay was and what she was doing and what her plans were. They were focused on what Adnan was doing. So here Rabia points out that it seems really odd that they didn't start interviewing witnesses until after they had arrested and charged their murder suspect. How does that make sense? So what we have here is not the police trying to figure out what happened, but the police trying to build a case against their suspect. And they're doing it with witnesses who have nearly 2 months for their memories to degrade from time. Well, they did actually have the interviews from Hay's friends during the missing persons investigation, but those statements were each only about 2 seconds as long, and they give no information of substance. But at least the Baltimore County Police, who did the missing persons investigation, wrote up notes. But their notes of the Krista interview, the one that happened on March 1st, they wrote those up on April 27th. And here's a funny, when they did finally write up the notes, they wrote the date of the interview as February 29th. It wasn't a leap year. There was no February 29th. So Colin and Susan point out how clear this makes it, that they weren't even concerned with accuracy, and it shows the shoddiness of the investigation. They were just like, well, we talked to her the day after we talked to Jay. We talked to Jay on the 28th, so Krista must have been on the 29th. And then they totally forgot that February 29th wasn't even a thing. So on March 2nd, 3 more people get interviewed by the police: Debbie, Aisha, and Ann. We haven't heard about Ann before. So who is Ann? Well, she used to spend basically every lunch period in the library. Debbie was trying to set Ann up with Adnan, but Adnan basically shied away from that because Ann had previously dated a Muslim friend of his. But Ann is the last person who shows up in Adnan's call log on the 13th at 10:30 p.m. Of course, no notes of these 3 interviews have ever been turned over. We know that Debbie and Aisha were called at trial to testify for the prosecution, but Ann is never contacted again by either side. In one of Debbie's later statements, she's asked, "Why do you think Adnan is guilty?" And she says, "Well, he was arrested. And also, Ann told me that the police said they had a bunch of evidence against him." So Rabia thinks maybe Ann had something exculpatory to say about Adnan, and that's why the police didn't call her to testify. That begs the question, though, of why Gutierrez never contacted her. Another thing we know about Ann is that she was in that same last period AP Psych class with Hay and Adnan, the last time Hay was seen alive. Did she see Hay at the end of class and maybe have information that contradicted the state's theory of the case? We don't know. Susan interjects, though, that although no notes were passed along, notes were taken. The interviews are listed on an index sheet in the police file, and it indicates that statements were taken. But those statements were never handed over, and they aren't in the file now. So what's up with that? Colin points out that if those notes and statements were useful to the police, we definitely have them. They were able to get all of the other files, Colin and Susan and Rabia were, because they got them when they filed the legal request to get files pertaining to the case. That's a thing you can do. But these statements, the one they're looking for and that were listed on the log sheet, weren't included. So it seems like that might be because these statements were accidentally on purpose misplaced, and maybe that's because the information wasn't helpful to the state's case. Colin also says he'd really love to have Debbie's first statement because her story changed so much between the first and second trials. It would be nice to have that original story to see how it has sort of been molded over time. Now, after this day of 3 interviews, 3 more weeks go by before the cops ever talk to anyone else who knew Hay. But on March 9th, they talked to Christy. That's not her real name, Kathy, which is weird because as of that point, there's no statement from Jay or Jen mentioning that she knew anything. So how did they find out that she was somebody they should talk to? Well, the easy explanation for that is that there were statements for Jay or Jen, from Jay or Jen, or from both of them, and they just weren't recorded or they weren't done in any official interview that was ever disclosed to the defense. For instance, we know that Jen met with the prosecutor on March 4th, and there were no notes from that. We know from Jay's boss at the video store that Jay talked to the police before February 28th, and there aren't notes about that. And at about this time of this interview with Christy, the cops were trying to learn all about how cell phone records and cell towers worked and trying to match them up with Christy's address. On March 11th, they follow up on some sort of information they got from Christy because they talked to her boyfriend, Jeff. They get a written statement from him, they talk to him, and then all of the information about him disappears. We have no idea what he said, if it corroborated Jay and Jen's stories, or if it went against them. Another interview they conducted on March 11th is with a girl named Patrice. According to Adnan's cell records, he placed a call at 3:59 p.m. to his friend Patrick. Patrice is Patrick's sister. But guess what? There was a written statement, it was logged in the index, and now we don't have it. So Colin recaps at this point. Out of 8 witnesses interviewed in the few days after Adnan is arrested, we don't have notes or statements for 5 of them. Colin references Brady versus Maryland, which of course you all know about. That's the case that says prosecution is required to turn over exculpatory information to the defense. It seems like maybe all of these missing statements and notes are a Brady violation. But how do we know if that information was exculpatory or not? It's just not there. He talks about how this is so bizarre and how he's worked with a ton of appeals cases, and he's never seen so much stuff that's logged and just not present. So here's another example. On February 28th, Jay doesn't say anything about Patrick. But on March 15th, 4 days after the interview with Patrice, Jay says that he called Patrick that day in order to find some weed. Patrick wasn't home, so when he called, he got voicemail and then talked to Patrice. So what if Patrice told them in her interview something other than that Jay called her trying to get Patrick? If so, then that information is a contradiction to Jay's story and should have been passed along to the defense because that's impeachment evidence. Impeachment evidence is evidence that contradicts and calls into question whether or not a witness is credible. Impeaching Jay on this particular call might seem like no big deal, but remember, if he was calling Patrick at 3:59 to get weed, he was also allegedly dropping off Adnan at track practice at 4 p.m. Well, it's not just interviews that took place and we have no notes of. There are also interviews that the police noted they should conduct, but never did actually conduct. There are people who Jay and Jen say have knowledge of the murder who were never questioned, like Tayyip. There's Jay's friend Chris. There's Nicole, the one who Jen says told her about strangulation being the cause of death and the one who said her mom found Hayes' body. There's Josh, who's Nicole's boyfriend. There's Mark, Jen's brother. There's maybe another Mark, maybe the same Mark, but a Mark, who was in the car with Jen and Josh and Nicole when they were discussing Hayes' murder. But the police never talked to any of them. So Mark, Jen's brother, should have been a no-brainer. Jay says he was at the house playing video games with him that afternoon. Seems like a really easy way to corroborate Jay's story. But no, they never interviewed him, and weirdly, Gutierrez didn't subpoena him either. Rabia points out that Mark was only 15. He should have been at school at the time that he was allegedly playing video games with Jay. What if there are school records documenting that Mark was in school at that time? That would totally undermine Jay's story. Even Jen says that she dropped Mark off at school that morning. Then there's this reference to the pre-interview before Jay's first official interview. Jay says that Jeff G. drove him to Woodlawn at 2:40 p.m. on January 13th to see Stephanie. So that contradicts the Jen and Mark story, but it also contradicts his own. He supposedly had Adnan's car. Did he give somebody else the car? Why would he be going to Woodlawn? Isn't that the last place he'd want to be at that time if he knew what had actually happened? And remember that not only is there this reference to Jeff G., but Jeff G. is also the person whose house Jay was going to when he got the come and get me call. But Jeff G. was never interviewed. He just disappeared from the record after this too. So at this point, Susan changes gears to talk about the subpoenas that were issued. Remember that the subpoenas are basically requests for information. They can be used to cause a person to come into court to testify, or they can be for a business or organization to hand over information. In this case, the first subpoena was issued on February 16th, a week after Hayes' body was found, and 11 days before Jay's first official interview. The interview that they say eventually led them to Adnan. This subpoena on the 16th was for Adnan's cell phone records. The interesting thing about this subpoena, other than its timing, is that it gives a very strong indication that this wasn't the first information the police had about Adnan's cell phone records. So here's a quote from that subpoena. To AT&T Wireless. You are therefore directed this 16th day of February 1999 to furnish the names and addresses for the following telephone number and 13 cell site locations from January 1st, 1999 to the present. So what's fishy about that? Well, the fact that they know that they need addresses for 13 cell site locations. If they've never seen Adnan's cell records before, how do they know how many cell sites they need addresses for? It just so happens Adnan's cell pings 13 cell towers on January 13th. How do they know that? Well, what they got in response to this was a list of all the call records from Adnan's cell phone, including the numbers of all the calls that Adnan had made and indications of the incoming calls received. But it didn't include the numbers those incoming calls came from. They could have gotten that information, and we knew that they could have done it because they had done it in other cases. They just chose not to get that information. So again, we have a situation where there's missing information that would have been so easy to get and would have answered so many questions, but we don't have that information. Like, which call on the list was the come and get me call? Well, it turns out that it's better for the police this way. In the current appeal, the state's brief, which is their response to Adnan's attorney asking for the appeal, they say that Asia's statement is irrelevant as an alibi. Because if they had wanted to, they could have just changed the time of the come and get me call at trial, and everything would have turned out the same way. Well, if they'd gotten the information about the incoming calls, they wouldn't have had that flexibility in their timeline. So maybe it was strategic to not find out the actual numbers of those incoming calls. Of course, if Gutierrez has tried, she probably could have found out if the payphone at Best Buy existed, and could have gotten records from that phone. And technically, she could have gotten the records of the incoming calls to Adnan's cell phone. Although cell phones were still pretty new, and she might not have known she could get the records of the incoming calls. But the police certainly knew they could. Colin interjects here with another comparison to other cases he's worked. He's never had a case where they've only had the records of the outgoing calls and not the incoming calls. So it had to have been a conscious decision that they made. So Susan then goes into an explanation of the Stored Communications Act, which describes the requirements that law enforcement and prosecutors have to abide by in obtaining records. Some of them can come with just a subpoena, others need an actual court order. What it boils down to is that to get a court order, the government entity has to offer specific and articulable facts showing that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the contents of whatever they're searching for are relevant and material to an ongoing criminal investigation. So it turns out that when the jury issued the court order to obtain the cell tower data, the only specific and articulable fact the state included was that Hay had been buried in Lincoln Park. The implication is that the cell records were relevant and material because they showed a link to Lincoln Park. But how would they know there was a link to Lincoln Park if they hadn't seen the cell records yet? So it seems like at some point in early February, somehow, the police realized that Adnan's cell phone pinged the tower covering the Lincoln Park area at 7:09 and 7:16. Then, every time they interviewed witnesses, they built their whole theory of the case around him being there at that time. Susan says there's one thing that could explain how that could happen, how they could know that information, and that's if they had done something called a tower dump. That basically means they get all of the information for a particular cell tower in a given time range. So if the cops did a tower dump for the cell tower labeled L689, which they could have done without a court order, they could have found that 2 calls had been made through the tower to Adnan's cell phone, and that could have led them to all of the information they had. Tower dumps were pretty new and rare at that time. It's questionable whether the cops would have even known tower dumps were a thing at that point. The DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, was sort of the leader in cell record information and tower dumps specifically. And it turns out that the Baltimore police had ties to the DEA. And if they needed information about how to conduct a cell record investigation, they could have easily gotten that information from the DEA. Now, we don't know if a tower dump was even done, and if it was done with the DEA's help. But we do know that the DEA helped with the investigation. On February 18th, the day after the police got the cell records back from the court order, the DEA issued a subpoena for the subscriber information for every phone number that Adnan had called during the first 72 hours that he'd had the cell phone. It's possible that the DEA could have submitted other subpoenas on behalf of the Baltimore police, and we wouldn't have those records because they were DEA records, not Baltimore police records. And we know that's possible because later on, the DEA submitted a subpoena for Bilal's cell records. If you don't remember, Bilal was that youth leader guy at the mosque who helped kids out. He helped Adnan get his cell phone. The only reason we know that the DEA issued the subpoena on Baltimore City's behalf is that AT&T mentions it in their cover letter when they respond, that it's in response to a DEA subpoena. We don't have a copy of that. The question is, did that happen more than just with Bilal's records? If it did, how many more times? It's not really a problem that the Baltimore police turned to the DEA for help. It makes sense. They have resources that the Baltimore police just don't have. What's concerning is the lack of disclosure about that help. So another thing the police did was subpoena subscriber information, like the phone number, the name of the subscriber, other account details, for a whole lot of people. But then they also went looking for actual call logs for a lot of people. The interesting thing is that they only asked for call logs for people who were Muslim and Pakistani. They didn't ask for Jen's call logs. They didn't ask for Jay's call logs. They didn't ask for Patrick's call logs. They only asked for call logs on Adnan's cell, Adnan's home, Yasser's cell, Bilal's cell, and the phone records of a woman named Elfrida Gill. Elfrida Gill is a Pakistani Christian woman who's a kind of community organizer. Rabia says everybody in the community knows her and calls her Auntie Elfrida. But why would her phone records have been accessed? Well, in March, Adnan's dad went to the high school to get Adnan's school records so he could keep up with high school while he was in jail. Elfrida Gill went with him to act as moral support. A Woodlawn High School official wrote down Elfrida Gill's name and license plate number and later told the police about it and gave them her information. Then the police subpoenaed her call records. Why? We don't really know. Her only connection to the case is that she's a friend of the Syed family. And she's Pakistani. And maybe Muslim as far as they know. They don't know. But remember, their theory of the case was that Adnan, as a Muslim male, went into a fit of rage because he had been dishonored and he'd killed Hay, and it was a part of his culture that allowed it to happen. So why link the race stuff to these cell record requests? Well, on February 15th, the police met with a group called the Ennahee Group. Their website says that they do business investigation, missing person investigation, computer fraud, industrial espionage, translation, software design, and market trend analysis. They were involved in the case when it was a missing persons investigation, and then they continued to be involved as it was a homicide investigation. They got involved because the consultant, the specific consultant working on it, is a friend of Hayes' uncle who requested that they get involved. This consultant is the one who wrote that ragingly inaccurate and biased cultural memo that was used at the bail hearing to justify keeping Adnan in jail. So it seems like the time of this meeting in mid-February is when the seeds of the motive theory took root. By March, they were calling the consultant for veil information, which is referring to the scarf that Adnan bought Hay as a gift when they were going out. Here's a section of the memo, just so you remember how this consultant interpreted the gift of the scarf. Clearly, Mr. Syed faced almost insurmountable odds to meet with this infidel or devil in secret. Ownership is not outside of his cultural belief system. After giving her a veil, literally covering her so that only he could have her, he set her apart from all others and for him alone. For all intents and purpose, he marked his territory by giving her a gift of great value within his culture. And in doing so, he sealed her fate with his. By receiving it, perhaps unwittingly, Heyman Lee accepted his standard of decorum. To have later been let down by her relationship with another man would certainly have been an obvious violation of his culture and a reason to destroy her. For her to have another man dishonored both Adnan Syed and his belief structure. It is acceptable for a Muslim man to control the actions of a woman by completely eliminating her, and still remains possible under this system to find peace and forgiveness with God at the same time. Within this harsh culture, he has not violated any code. He has defended his honor. Heyman Lee's womanhood diminished her worth, and the act of violence resulting in her death. Under Islamic law, her murder was sanctioned. For many ethnic Pakistanis, incidents like this are commonplace, and in Pakistan, this would not have been a crime, but probably a matter of honor. The memo goes on. It's much longer. You can find it on the Undisclosed website if you want to look at the whole thing. Now, Sarah Koenig, the podcaster from Serial, didn't think that this memo was really instrumental to the case. But Rabia says she really thinks this is what caused the police to focus on Adnan, even more so than him being the ex-boyfriend. Susan says she may be overly optimistic and that she can't believe that anyone believed this racist portrayal deep down in their hearts, and they just saw it as a convenient way to frame their case and get a conviction. They didn't actually believe the stuff they were saying. But really, is that any better? Colin points out that if it were just this private internal document, that would be one thing. But they made it public at the bail hearing. We'll get to that in a few episodes. But they took this horrible memo to a new level. Again, he refers to his history of cases and says it's probably the most awful thing he's ever seen in a file on a case. Okay, so there were other subpoenas filed in the case, but the timing of them is kind of sketchy. There was one for the dumpsters, where Jay says he threw away the shovels and his clothes, and Adnan threw away the stuff from Hay. The police waited until March 19th to file a subpoena. They don't do any searching before that. Maybe they thought it was a dead end, but then why do it at all? Why not do it on February 27th or 28th, right after Jay tells them about it? And even if you don't recover the items, isn't someone at a facility somewhere going to remember a shovel or a pick being in amongst the cardboard boxes and paper mixed in with the recycling? But maybe the police were afraid they weren't there. Then there's Best Buy. It's reasonable to believe that the security camera footage would have been recycled by the time they got Jay's story. But shouldn't they go there and ask some questions, see if somebody saw something? Someone was allegedly murdered in a parking lot and moved from the front seat to the trunk at 3 p.m. in broad daylight. There's a good chance that someone has something to say about it. But the police wait until April 13th to even go to Best Buy and check it out and subpoena records about recordings and who was working that day. That's a month and a half after they find out where the alleged murder scene was. Of course, the real kicker is that the crux of the state's case is the premeditation, that Adnan gave Jay the cell phone so he could call him, and that he called him from Best Buy. But they never got any proof that a call went from Best Buy to that cell phone. And here's a fun update. When Jay gave a recent interview to the Intercept, which, of course, they've referenced that Intercept interview before, he changed his story again. He said that the murder didn't occur in the Best Buy parking lot. Adnan just walked up to him there, and the trunk pop happened somewhere else, too. So there are only two reasons the police didn't do these searches. One is that they are totally and completely incompetent. The other is that they didn't believe this stuff had anything to do with the murder in the first place, and what they were going to find out would go against their case. As if this isn't all frustrating enough, for a lot of the subpoenas, we know that they were sent out, but we don't know what they got back, including a subpoena to the dumpster company, a subpoena to Best Buy, a subpoena for Jay's employment records, a subpoena for Jen's employment records, and a subpoena for Jen's pager. So the police did use the DEA to subpoena the number that Jay said was Jen's pager number. They ended up having to go through a chain of paperwork to get to the right company, and they finally do. They send out another subpoena to the right company, and we have no results. There is nothing in the files about what the company sent back. The problem with this is that we can't identify this number in the cell record as actually Jen's pager. In fact, in the first trial, Jay testifies that he placed a page to that number, but refers to the person he's paging as him 2 times. Why would he be using male pronouns if it's Jen's pager? Then, also in the first trial, Christy is shown a list of the call records and is asked if she recognizes any of the numbers. She picks out Jen's home number, but then says, "I don't know any of the other numbers on here." Jen is her best friend. Why can't she recognize Jen's pager number if it's actually Jen's pager number? And that number being Jen's pager number is really important to the state's narrative. Jay says he contacted Jen from Lincoln Park by paging her, and then she called him back. The timing of the calls to this number are really important, and we have no idea if it's actually Jen's pager or not. Another thing that's pretty disturbing, and actually is in the records, is that the police were issuing grand jury subpoenas after Adnan had been indicted. Indictment means that the grand jury has gotten a chance to look at some of the state's evidence and decided that there's enough evidence and there's probable cause for a trial to take place. The problem is that you can't issue subpoenas for information you want to give a grand jury after the grand jury proceeding is over and the grand jury has already made their decision. But the police were issuing grand jury subpoenas for nearly 2 weeks after Adnan was indicted on April 13th. So there's one more witness the police interviewed, Adnan himself. They only interviewed him once, on February 26th, the day before we know that Jay had his first official taped interview, and about an hour before Jay's interview. There are 2 write-ups of the interview Adnan had with the police. The first one is dated February 27th, the day after the interview. It says that Mr. Syed provided personal information, along with information as to his relationship with Heyman Lee. This note wasn't produced to the defense, but it seems pretty innocuous. Not a lot was said. It was written a day after the interview took place, and it was fresh in the detectives' minds. So, okay. But then on September 3rd, right before the trial, the prosecution informed the defense that a report was being written documenting the last known interview of the defendant prior to his arrest. No report was actually produced, though, after September 3rd. Then on November 9th, the prosecution wrote a new disclosure. It said, "The state erred in its amended disclosure of September 3rd when it said a report was being prepared concerning an interview conducted with the defendant. In fact, that report concerned an interview with a different witness. All required discovery concerning statements made by or interviews conducted with the defendant have been made." So this is a month before trial. And at this point, Adnan's attorney has no documentation of the interview Adnan gave to the police on February 26th. But the state has to turn something over. So you know when they do that? January 18th, right before the second trial. But that statement that they hand over on January 18th is dated September 14th. So on September 14th, someone sat down and did a summary of the interview that took place on February 26th. Here's what it says. On 26 February 1999, at approximately 1900 hours, your investigator, along with Detective William F. Ritz, had the occasion to respond to Adnan's house and interview Adnan Syed in the presence of his father. During this interview, Syed relayed the following information. Syed indicated that he knew the victim, Heyman Lee, and that she was a friend of his. He also indicated that he had known the victim for several years. On January 13th, 1999, he had the occasion to be at school, Woodlawn Senior High. However, doesn't remember the events that occurred that school day. When asked if Syed had a relationship with Heyman Lee, Syed replied in a soft voice, yes. However, he didn't want his father to know. Syed indicated that he had occasion to be a passenger in the victim's auto, however, not on the date in question. Syed stated that he had no idea who would want to have hurt Heyman Lee and that he could provide no information on suspects. Syed indicated that Haley had been seeing an individual named Don, who apparently worked with the victim at LensCrafters. Your investigator asked Syed's father if it would be possible to speak with Syed at school on a later date. Same indicated that it would be possible if he was present. Investigation to continue. Why is this memo so much more detailed than the notes that were written the day after the actual interview? Also, why wasn't it produced earlier? It's dated September 14th, right after the September 3rd disclosure, which was somehow followed up by the November 9th, haha, there's no disclosure, it was actually somebody else, even though obviously there was something to disclose. And it's crazy because there was no reason not to disclose this. And then who was this other witness they were writing up a statement about? We actually never get that disclosure. So either the prosecution completely lied in this very bizarre way to cover up this memo, or the prosecution has a memo of some other witness and they never produced it. Either way, that's misconduct on the part of the prosecutor. So to bring it back full circle, there were 5 out of 8 witnesses who were interviewed after Adnan's arrest, and those statements were never produced. Was this one being referred to one of those? So if we're going to summarize this episode, it seems like the police never actually bothered to investigate the crime to find out what really happened to Hay. They limited their investigation to what they could use to build a case against Adnan. Of course, there eventually was a second interview with Adnan, and that happened 2 days after the first interview. It happened on February 28th when Adnan was finally arrested. And that's the topic of next week's episode.